The room was already thick with tension when Stephen Miller leaned forward, his voice cutting like a blade through the air. For the sixth time, he interrupted Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence. His tone was sharp, dismissive, dripping with the arrogance of someone convinced he could bulldoze his way through any opponent. Each word he hurled was less about substance and more about dominance, the sound of entitlement echoing off the walls. Crockett, however, didn't flinch. She sat steady, her posture upright, her gaze locked forward. The frustration was palpable. Viewers, watching at home, could feel it in their bones. Supporters in the room shifted uncomfortably, and even Miller's allies glanced sideways as his interruptions piled up one after another. 6 times. 6 sharp, deliberate attempts to silence a voice that refused to be muted. And then it happened. On the 6th interruption, Crockett stopped speaking. She didn't argue, didn't fight to raise her volume above his. Instead, she simply paused. A long, calculated pause that made even Miller falter for half a beat. She drew in a quiet breath, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal she wasn't defeated. She was waiting. She was loading the kind of line that history remembers, the kind of moment that flips the entire script. The silence stretched across the chamber, heavy and electric. Viewers leaned closer to their screens. Phones were already in people's hands, ready to clip whatever was about to unfold. Crockett's lips parted, but instead of rushing her words, she measured them. The calm in her tone stood in total contrast to Miller's frenzy. It was the sound of someone who knew the fight was already hers, someone who understood the true power of timing. In that instant, Miller's interruptions no longer looked like strength. They looked like desperation. His face tightened, his impatience visible. But Crockett? She was unshaken. She was about to unleash her 7th line, and when she did, it wouldn't just reclaim her time, it would reclaim the entire narrative. What she said next left the chamber frozen in disbelief. Allies smiled, critics stumbled, and for a moment even Stephen Miller had nothing left to say. But before we get to her legendary 7th line, we need to understand how the stage was set. To understand why that chamber felt like it was vibrating with tension, we need to step back from the moment of interruption and look at the bigger picture. This wasn't just a routine hearing, another day of political sparring and procedural noise. No, this was a stage where the very definition of America was on trial. Every question, every testimony, every exchange carried a weight far greater than the words spoken in that room. The issue at hand was more than policy. It was identity. It was about who gets to belong, who gets to speak, and whose voices are deemed worthy of respect. For many watching, especially immigrants and communities of color, this wasn't abstract politics. It was personal. It was a reminder of the constant fight to be heard in a system that too often rewards volume over truth, privilege over principle. Stephen Miller, long associated with some of the harshest and most exclusionary policies of the last decade, represented one side of that struggle, the voice of restriction, the champion of division, the man who believed that control of the microphone equaled control of the narrative. His interruptions weren't random, they were symbolic. Every time he cut off Jasmine Crockett, he was enacting the same power play that so many communities know all too well, the attempt to silence, to dominate, to erase. But Crockett's presence in that chamber was itself a defiance of that script. She represented not only her constituents, but a broader America, the America of resilience, of rising voices, of people who had clawed their way into spaces where they were told they didn't belong. Every word she spoke carried echoes of that struggle. Every pause demanded to be heard. She wasn't just answering questions. She was holding ground for countless others who rarely get the microphone. The stakes of this clash reached far beyond the walls of the hearing. For one side, it was about maintaining a grip on the old order, about silencing inconvenient truths. For the other, it was about carving space for dignity, for fairness, for the simple right to finish a sentence without being trampled. And that was why viewers felt their hearts race with every interruption. They weren't just watching Miller versus Crockett. They were watching two Americas collide. The tension escalated with each exchange. Allies on Crockett's side leaned in, visibly bristling at Miller's tactics. Commentators online began buzzing in real time, drawing sharp lines between arrogance and composure, between noise and clarity. This wasn't politics as usual, it was a morality play, a mirror reflecting deeper cultural battles that ripple through every dinner table, every workplace, every neighborhood, and in that high-stakes environment, every word mattered. Crockett's calm tone, her insistence on facts and fairness, contrasted with Miller's blunt force interruptions. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a clash of visions. Which America would prevail? The one that silences or the one that listens? The one that divides or the one that includes? The chamber wasn't just an echo of the past, it was a preview of the future. And as the interruptions piled up, the stakes only grew higher. Because every time Crockett was cut off, the audience's hunger for justice swelled. Everyone was waiting to see how long she would endure, how she would answer, and whether she could transform frustration into triumph. And yet, while Crockett came prepared with facts, Stephen Miller came armed with something else entirely. To grasp why Stephen Miller's sixth interruption landed with such venom, you have to know the man behind the voice. He isn't just any political operative. He is a figure whose name has become synonymous with exclusion, with walls built both literal and metaphorical. For years, Miller cultivated a reputation as the hard edge of policy, the architect of some of the most divisive ideas in American politics. His presence in that chamber wasn't just incidental, it was a continuation of a career marked by confrontation, by bulldozing through opposition with a mix of condescension and unyielding self-righteousness. From his earliest days in Washington, Miller thrived on provocation. Where others sought consensus, he sought domination. He carried himself with the air of a man convinced he was always the smartest in the room, a strategist who mistook arrogance for intellect. His words rarely invited dialogue. They demanded submission. To him, conversation was not an exchange. It was a battleground where only his voice should remain standing. His legacy spoke louder than any interruption. Miller was known as the driving force behind policies that split families, that reduced human beings to statistics, that treated compassion as weakness. The public persona he projected, methodical, sharp-tongued, unflinching, was carefully constructed. But underneath that image lay a contradiction. For all his supposed discipline and intellect, his strategy often relied less on reason and more on brute force, overwhelming opponents with volume, aggression, and sheer relentlessness. He wasn't there to persuade. He was there to overwhelm. That pattern was on full display in the hearing. Each time he cut off Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't about clarifying points or debating substance. It was about asserting dominance, about reenacting the very dynamics that had defined his career. To silence was to win. To interrupt was to control. And to control was to erase voices that challenged his worldview. Yet his tactics carried their own poison. The more he interrupted, the more his composure frayed. What once might have looked like strength began to reveal cracks of insecurity. His need to dominate betrayed a fear of being bested, a fear of what might happen if the other side was truly heard. Because Miller, for all his bravado, knew the power of words delivered with calm precision, and he feared them. That's why he never let Crockett finish. Each interruption was not just an attack on her voice, but a defense mechanism against the truth she carried. And in that sense, his arrogance became his weakness. He mistook volume for victory, not realizing that audiences today can see through noise. They can tell when someone is trying too hard to bury the truth under bluster. Observers who had followed Miller's career knew this scene was familiar. It echoed his earlier clashes on television. His rigid, cutting sound bites, designed less for enlightenment and more for intimidation. He had long relied on the same playbook: seize the floor, control the tempo, silence the opposition. But hearings are not scripted press conferences. Crockett was not a pundit playing defense. She was a woman who had built her career on resilience, and she wasn't about to let her words be swallowed by arrogance. Miller's interruptions exposed him. They revealed the hollowness behind the bluster. And they reminded the audience of everything he represented: The policies that divided, the speeches that excluded, the persona that thrived on shutting others down. He wasn't just a participant in that room. He was the embodiment of a larger force in American life, one that seeks control by silencing rather than persuading. And yet, this time would be different. Because unlike so many before her, Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to yield, to shrink, or to be drowned out. She carried with her the quiet strength of someone who had been underestimated before and had turned that underestimation into fuel. Stephen Miller had spent his career perfecting the art of interruption, mistaking it for power. But in that chamber on that day, he was about to discover the limits of his strategy. He didn't know it yet. But the woman sitting across from him was prepared to dismantle not just his words, but the very foundation of his approach. But Miller didn't know he was about to meet his match in someone who refused to be silenced. To understand the gravity of Jasmine Crockett's composure in that chamber, we need to step into her story, one forged not in privilege or entitlement, but in resilience and grit. Crockett's path was not smoothed by connections or inherited power. It was carved piece by piece through long nights, relentless battles, and an unshakable commitment to justice. Raised in an America that often told her she didn't belong at the table, she fought to pull out her own chair. From an early age, Crockett understood what it meant to be underestimated, to have her intelligence questioned, to be spoken over in rooms where she had every right to speak. Those experiences did not break her. They refined her. They sharpened her into someone who could not only survive the storm, but command it. Her early career as a public defender revealed the contours of her character. Day after day, she stood in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients, where the system was tilted by design. She learned quickly that defending dignity meant more than quoting statutes. It meant carrying the weight of those who had no one else. It meant being a shield in a world that could be merciless. Those courtroom battles gave her more than legal skills. They gave her a kind of armor, an unshakable calm in the face of chaos, a determination to hold steady when the other side sought to rattle her. But Crockett's journey wasn't only about the law. It was about representation. She stepped into political life not out of ambition for the spotlight, but out of a refusal to let voices like hers be silenced. She carried into office the lived reality of those who had been dismissed, interrupted, ignored. And with each election, with each speech, she built a reputation, a woman who did not crumble under pressure, who did not fold when power tried to smother her voice. Her presence in Congress was more than symbolic. It was a statement. A black woman in a space historically designed to exclude her, speaking truth to men who had long assumed their word was final. She embodied not just her district, but a broader America, the America that thrives on diversity, the America that insists on being heard even when the microphones are turned down. That composure, that battle-tested resolve was on full display the day she faced Stephen Miller. Where others might have lost patience, raised their voices, or mirrored his aggression, Crockett drew on years of training. She had learned that power isn't always in the loudest shout. It's in the stillness that follows. It's in the refusal to be moved. She knew that interruptions could only drown her out if she let them, and she had long since decided that silence would never be her fate. For her supporters, watching her sit tall in the chamber was deeply personal. They saw themselves in her posture, in her restraint, in the quiet fire of her eyes. They saw the girl who had been told to stay quiet in class, the worker passed over for a promotion, the citizen dismissed at the ballot box. Crockett's fight was their fight. Her voice was their voice. And when Miller's attempts to bulldoze her grew louder, their anticipation swelled. They knew, instinctively, that Crockett had something in store. What made her presence so remarkable wasn't just her readiness for the confrontation. It was the way her entire journey seemed to converge in that single moment. Every courtroom where she defended the voiceless, every campaign where she fought uphill battles, every time she was told no and answered with persistence, it all gathered behind her like a storm preparing to break. And so, when Stephen Miller leaned forward and cut her off, once, twice, and then 6 times, Crockett didn't crumble. She didn't match his volume with volume. She waited. She studied him. She let the interruptions pile up, one after another, knowing that patience was its own kind of weapon, because Crockett understood what Miller did not. Interruption is not victory. It is fear disguised as control, and she had spent her whole life proving that fear can never outlast resilience. And when Miller interrupted her once, twice, and then 6 times, it was clear something unforgettable was about to unfold. The clash began like the steady drumbeat of a storm rolling closer. Stephen Miller, true to form, wielded interruption as his weapon of choice. Each time Jasmine Crockett attempted to lay out her point, his voice came slicing in sharp and insistent, determined to throw her off balance. At first, Crockett answered calmly, resetting her words with the patience of someone who had endured this routine before. But Miller's persistence was relentless. He leaned in, raised his voice, talked over her sentences as though volume could erase meaning. Viewers watching the exchange felt their blood pressure rise. It was the same frustration experienced around countless dinner tables and boardrooms. The irritation of seeing a woman, particularly a woman of color, forced to wrestle the floor back from a man who couldn't bear to let her finish. The second interruption came quickly on the heels of the first. Crockett's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but she pressed on, weaving her point with precision. Then came the third, louder this time, Miller pressing his advantage as if sheer aggression would carry the day. By the fourth, allies in the chamber shifted uncomfortably, their expressions betraying disbelief. It was as if Miller was less interested in debating policy and more determined to establish control. And yet Crockett didn't waver. Each time his voice surged, she steadied hers. Each time he sought to throw her rhythm, she reclaimed it with quiet determination. She wasn't simply arguing her case, she was performing a kind of endurance, showing the audience that dignity could stand unbroken even under siege. By the fifth interruption, the chamber was buzzing. The frustration wasn't only Crockett's to bear. It belonged to every viewer who had ever been spoken over, dismissed, or undermined. Social media lit up in real time. Hashtags forming, comments pouring in. Let her speak. This is exactly what women face every day. The hearing had become more than a political exchange. It was a stage on which the oldest battles of power and respect were being replayed before the world's eyes. When the sixth interruption landed, it was no longer just irritating, it was intolerable. Miller's words crashed over Crockett's mid-sentence, his tone brash, his gestures exaggerated. The audience at home practically shouted at their screens, willing her to push back, demanding that she take her moment. And in that very instant, Crockett did something unexpected. She stopped. She didn't try to shout over him. She didn't rush. She let silence hang, thick and undeniable, while Miller's voice trailed into the void he had created for himself. The effect was electric. For the first time, the interruptions didn't seem like strength. They seemed like desperation. Crockett's stillness transformed the energy in the room. Miller, oblivious to the shift, sat poised for yet another attempt to cut her off, convinced his dominance remained unshaken. But everyone else could sense it. Something was about to change. The chamber was no longer a place of interruptions. It was a stage waiting for a moment of clarity, for the counterstrike that would reverberate far beyond those walls. Crockett's calm gaze, her deliberate breath, her refusal to be flustered, all of it was a signal. She had endured the interruptions, weathered the storm, and now the storm itself was about to turn. And then came the moment, the seventh exchange, that turned everything upside down. The sixth interruption still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Stephen Miller leaned back in his chair, a small flicker of triumph crossing his face, as though he believed the sheer force of his voice had won the day. He thought he had broken the rhythm, shattered the flow, and reduced Jasmine Crockett to another casualty of his domineering style. But what he didn't realize was that Crockett was not retreating. She was preparing. The pause she allowed after his outburst was not hesitation. It was strategy. A deliberate stillness that commanded attention more powerfully than any raised voice could. The silence was so complete that even the hum of air conditioning seemed to grow louder. Those in the chamber leaned in, sensing the shift. Viewers at home stopped scrolling, stopped multitasking. Something was about to happen, and everyone could feel it. Crockett inhaled, slow and steady. Her eyes locked on Miller, not with rage, but with the calm precision of someone who had decided the game was already hers. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no trace of frustration, no sign of fluster. Instead, it was cool, deliberate. Every syllable weighted like a stone dropped into still water. "Mr. Miller," she began, her tone quiet enough that the room had to hush to hear her. "You've interrupted me 6 times now, and each time you've mistaken volume for victory. But here's the truth." Her words cut through the air with the sharpness of a blade wrapped in silk. Miller blinked, clearly not expecting such poise. He had braced for pushback, for shouting, for some heated exchange he could meet with more aggression. Instead, what he received was composure, lethal in its restraint. Crockett leaned forward just slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Every interruption doesn't silence me. It only proves how much you fear what I have to say." The line landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled across the chamber. For a split second, the entire room froze, caught in the impact of her words. Miller's jaw tightened, his practiced confidence faltering. He opened his mouth as though to respond, but no sound came. The sheer clarity of her statement had rendered him, for the first time that day, speechless. And then came the 7th line, the one that transformed the exchange from tense sparring into history. Crockett's voice lowered, steady, each word deliberate. "You can interrupt me 100 times if you'd like, but the record will always show your noise disappears and my words remain." The sentence landed with the weight of finality, like a gavel striking wood at the end of a trial. It was precise, devastating, and unforgettable. Delivered not with anger, but with the calm certainty of truth, it stripped Miller's interruptions of all their power. The metaphor was perfect. Noise vanishes, words endure. In that instant, Crockett had reframed the entire confrontation, shifting the balance of power in one sweeping stroke. Miller sat frozen. His mouth opened again, but the fight had left him. The aggressor who had bulldozed through 6 interruptions now looked smaller, diminished, exposed. His eyes darted briefly, searching for footing that no longer existed. Because Crockett hadn't just answered him, she had dismantled him. The chamber erupted. Some gasped audibly, unable to mask their shock. Others broke into smiles, shaking their heads in disbelief at the brilliance of her counter. Even those who had tried to maintain neutral expressions failed. The shift was too powerful to ignore. The energy was electric. The atmosphere transformed from suffocating tension to collective release. For those watching at home, the moment was cinematic, like the climax of a courtroom drama where the underdog delivers the line that flips the entire narrative. Social media exploded instantly. Clips of her words flooded timelines, hashtags sprouted in seconds. Her words, remain, 7th line, Crockett vs. Miller. Viewers weren't just witnessing politics, they were witnessing a story, a parable of dignity triumphing over arrogance. But inside the chamber, the aftermath was even more striking. Miller, once so quick to dominate, sat visibly rattled. His fingers tapped nervously against the table, his usual mask of superiority cracked. Crockett, by contrast, remained still. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even raise her voice in victory. She simply let the silence do its work. Because she understood something Miller never had. True power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be heard once. And as the room settled, as the murmurs quieted into an uneasy calm, the weight of what had just occurred became undeniable. This wasn't merely a clever retort. It was a turning point, a crystallizing moment in which Crockett seized the narrative, not only silencing her opponent, but embodying something larger. The resilience of those who have been interrupted for centuries, who have been told their voices don't matter, who have been drowned out only to rise louder in the echoes that follow. The hearing continued, of course. Questions were asked, answers given. But nothing else that day mattered as much as that one exchange. It became the headline, the soundbite, the memory that lingered. Because Crockett had done more than hold her ground. She had shifted it beneath her opponent's feet. For those watching, it wasn't just politics. It was vindication. It was proof that patience and dignity could triumph over arrogance and noise. It was the reminder that when history remembers moments of truth, it rarely recalls the interruptions. It recalls the words that cut through them. Stephen Miller had walked into that chamber armed with the only weapon he knew: dominance through disruption. But in Jasmine Crockett, he encountered something his tactics could not defeat: the calm precision of a woman who understood her power, who embodied the truth that interruptions fade, but justice lingers. And so, as the clip of her seventh line spread like wildfire, as her words etched themselves into the digital memory of a nation hungry for such clarity, one truth became undeniable: Miller had underestimated her. And the price of that mistake was his silence. But the story didn't end with that line. In many ways, it had just begun. It took less than 5 minutes. Before the hearing had even moved to its next agenda item, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's seventh line was already ricocheting across phones, laptops, and television screens. What had started as another tense exchange in a congressional chamber transformed almost instantly into a cultural event. Social media became the amplifier. The moment Crockett uttered, "Your noise disappears and my words remain," timelines lit up. On X, formerly Twitter, hashtags mushroomed out of nowhere. Her words remain, Sure seventh line, Sure Crockett vs. Miller. Within the hour, the phrase was trending in multiple cities. People who had never before tuned into a congressional hearing were now glued to the replay, dissecting every frame, every pause, every flicker of expression on Miller's face. TikTok stitched the moment into countless remixes, slow-motion edits with dramatic music, lip syncs where creators mouthed Crockett's words as if they were battle cries, reaction videos where young activists screamed, cheered, and even wept at the sheer precision of her takedown. Instagram reels spread clips like wildfire, captions dripping with admiration. "This is how you handle arrogance. Crockett for the win." When history is written, this is the soundbite they'll remember. And then the celebrities joined in. A-list actors reposted the clip with clapping emojis. Musicians turned the line into hooks for freestyle riffs. Even athletes fresh off wins quoted Crockett in post-game interviews. The phrase had leapt out of politics and into pop culture, a shorthand for dignity triumphing over disrespect. Cable news seized the moment, playing the clip on a loop. Progressive commentators framed it as a long-awaited example of how to confront authoritarian swagger with grace and power. This wasn't just a rebuttal, one analyst declared on live television. This was the embodiment of resilience, a reminder that history bends toward those who refuse to be silenced. Even typically restrained anchors couldn't mask their awe. The delivery, they said, was surgical, but it wasn't only allies who reacted. Even Crockett's critics found themselves acknowledging, albeit grudgingly, the sharpness of her strike. Conservative pundits tried to spin it. Some mocked the social media frenzy, others insisted the moment was overblown, but the more they downplayed it, the more they revealed their discomfort. Because the truth was undeniable, Miller had been stunned and Crockett had owned the moment. The cultural echo grew stranger and more powerful by the hour. Graphic designers created posters with her words in bold typography, styled like protest art. College students spray-painted the phrase across campus free speech walls. A Brooklyn coffee shop even printed it on a limited-run series of mugs that sold out in a single afternoon. What she had said wasn't just memorable, it was repeatable. It became a mantra. For many, the line tapped into something personal. Women who had been spoken over in boardrooms. Immigrants who had been told to keep quiet, young activists who had been dismissed by politicians. Each of them heard themselves in her voice. They didn't just see a congresswoman dismantling Stephen Miller, they saw validation of their own lived experiences. The proof that interruption could be survived, outlasted, and ultimately defeated. The comments under every clip told the story. "I wish I had this line when my boss tried to cut me off." This is every immigrant kid at the dinner table, silenced, and then rising stronger. She spoke for all of us who have been told our voices don't matter. The resonance wasn't political alone. It was deeply human. By the end of the day, Crockett's words had traveled beyond the United States. International outlets picked up the story, framing it as an American flashpoint in the struggle between authoritarian dominance and democratic dignity. In London, headlines described her as the congresswoman who silenced Trump's strategist. In India, op-eds praised her composure. In Brazil, activists carried placards quoting her words at a rally. A single sentence had leapt borders, languages, and cultures. Miller, meanwhile, tried to move on. His allies insisted the moment was a blip, a sideshow. But their dismissal only fueled the narrative. If it truly didn't matter, why was everyone talking about it? Why were millions replaying that clip? Why were late-night hosts weaving Crockett's line into their opening monologues? The answer was simple. Because it wasn't just about a clever retort. It was about power and who holds it. It was about how voices long pushed aside could rise and dominate the room with nothing more than clarity and conviction. Crockett had struck a nerve, and the ripple effects could not be contained. And so, as the hashtags swelled, as the memes multiplied, as the applause poured in from both allies and unexpected corners, one truth crystallized. This was not just a viral moment. It was a cultural touchstone, a reminder that the battles inside hearing rooms often speak to battles far beyond them, and beyond the memes and applause. There was a deeper lesson that resonated far beyond the hearing room. In the end, what Jasmine Crockett delivered was more than just a sharp retort in a heated chamber. It was a lesson, etched not only into the political record, but into the cultural consciousness of everyone who witnessed it. Her words revealed something timeless. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. Truth will always outshine lies, and respect will always matter more than the hollow performance of dominance. For years, voices like Stephen Miller's have thrived on volume, interruption, and intimidation. They win moments by seizing airtime, by pushing others out, by mistaking force for power. But Crockett reminded the nation of something deeper, that real power doesn't come from speaking the loudest. It comes from speaking with conviction, with restraint, and with an unshakable belief in justice. Her silence before the seventh line wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was the calm before the storm that left everyone listening, breath held, waiting for truth to cut through the noise. And when it did, the room changed. The interruption ceased to matter. The bullying shrank into background static. What remained was her clarity, her poise, and her voice, unmoved, unbroken, undeniable. That is why this moment mattered. Not just because one congresswoman bested a political operative in a battle of words. Not just because a viral clip embarrassed a man known for arrogance. It mattered because it became a mirror for every person who has ever been talked over, dismissed, or silenced. Crockett gave them proof that patience, preparation, and dignity are not just survival tools, they are weapons of transformation. The lesson is as old as history itself. Noise fades, but truth remains. Empires of arrogance crumble, but courage endures. And in an era where disinformation spreads faster than fact, Crockett's stand was a beacon, reminding us that even a single sentence delivered with precision can pierce through the storm and steady the ground beneath us. What she did in that chamber rippled far beyond politics. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a battle of values. On one side, the posture of domination, the attempt to control by disruption. On the other, the discipline of listening, the courage to wait, and the faith that when the time came, words could reshape the moment. In that contrast, America was reminded of the better angels of its character, that democracy isn't sustained by silencing others, but by amplifying the dignity of every voice. Her victory wasn't just personal, it was collective. It belonged to every immigrant who carried their parents' hopes. It belonged to every woman who'd been talked over in meetings. It belonged to every young person told to wait their turn when they had something urgent to say. Crockett's seventh line wasn't simply her rebuttal, it became their anthem, and perhaps that's why the world will remember it. Not because it humiliated a man, but because it elevated a principle. That courage delivered calmly can be louder than cruelty shouted repeatedly. That even in the chaos of interruption, there is space for one clear voice to rise above. In a world where voices are too often silenced, one woman proved that courage can break through the noise. And in doing so, she gave us all permission to believe that our words too can carry. And that's why her seventh line will be remembered long after the echoes of that room have faded. And so we return to where it all began. Stephen Miller interrupting Jasmine Crockett again and again, convinced that his volume and arrogance could drown her out. But in the end, it wasn't his 6 interruptions that history remembered. It was her 7th line, the moment when a calm, measured voice cut sharper than 1,000 shouted words. This wasn't just a clash in a hearing room. It was a showdown between two visions of America, one that thrives on intimidation and noise, and one that rises on dignity, clarity, and truth. Miller may have tried to dominate the stage, but Crockett transformed the stage itself. And in doing so, she proved that arrogance can never outlast integrity. That's why this story matters, because it reminds us of who we are and who we can be when we refuse to be silenced. Crockett's 7th line didn't just shut Miller down. It lit a fire that spread across social media, across the nation, across the world. It became more than a viral clip. It became a testament to the enduring power of courage, and now it's up to us. If her words resonated with you, if you felt the spark of recognition, the validation, the hope, don't let this moment fade into the scroll of yesterday's news. Share it, talk about it, pass it forward. Let others know that dignity is stronger than dominance, and that truth, spoken with conviction, can reshape even the loudest room. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in amplifying voices that matter. Join this community if you're ready to stand on the side of justice, resilience, and pride. Because in the end, her words remain, and so will ours if we choose to speak them.